Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another one of our In Conversation webinars. This is an ongoing series of talks that are a core part of our mission at Artlogic to support the art community with valuable insights, meaningful conversations that reflect the evolving challenges and opportunities facing galleries, dealers, artists, and collectors today. My name is Billy Maker. I'm an account director here at Artlogic, and I'll be your host for today's session. So today we're diving into a pressing and fast developing issues for galleries around the world. Favorite topic, US tariffs and what they mean for international art sales, cross-border operations. We're seeing this from the rising costs, shipping delays to potential compliant risks and business disruptions. So tariffs are becoming a serious consideration in the day-to-day operations of our galleries and clients working globally. So luckily to help us break it all down, thrilled to be joined by Edouard Gouin, the CEO of Convelio. So Convelio is a global leader in the fine art logistics industry with deep expertise in cross-border shipping and customs regulation. So welcome, Edouard. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Billy. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, no problem. So we're going to explore the current state of tariffs. As we know, the current state could change tomorrow, but that's why we're on this doing this webinar. What's changing in 2025 and beyond, and what steps galleries can take to protect their margins, stay compliant, and remain agile in a shifting global market. So these are things we're going to try to cover. And I think, Edouard, we were talking about this earlier. I think it's important just to begin with kind of a high level overview. So where we are currently today with US tariffs as they relate to the art world. And also it's good to kind of look back at what's changed just in the past few weeks to understand why we are where we are now.
Sure thing. So to start, yeah, if we have a look a little bit at kind of what has happened the past couple of weeks. So on April 2nd, Donald Trump announced quite a lot of new tariffs, like which can be defined as blanket tariffs, which was 10% for the UK, 20% for the EU, 34% for China, and many others. And essentially, the way the tariffs were structured was that they were made of two tiers. So there was the first tier, which was 10%, essentially impacting all imports as of April 5th. And the second tier, which was to vary per country. It was essentially 0% for the UK, 10% for the EU, 24% for China. That was supposed to come into effect on April 9th. And so essentially when that was communicated, at that point, we had no idea whether artworks were going to be impacted. We knew there were already exemptions for artwork historically, but we didn't know whether these exemptions would still hold. What we realized kind of digging into the regulations was that they were actually still holding. So as it stands, artwork are exempt. And what we mean by artwork is like essentially the way it's described in one of the regulations, which is like this 1702B clause that I think everybody has heard about by now, which essentially excludes, artworks, books, films, photographs, et cetera. And kind of the latest evolution of that is that on April 9th, Donald Trump announced that essentially the second tier of the tariffs would be paused for a period of 90 days. And that's kind of where we stand now, right? Like with the exception, obviously, of China, which we can talk about.
Yeah. You mentioned something about kind of this, the 1702B. Now, what's interesting is like, well, when you look at the details of it, it's like, why is fine art, currently exempt under, the regulations? So the IEEPA or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, because it's pretty interesting why it falls underneath something that's exempt.
Yeah, so we did quite a bit into that, just essentially in the beginning out of pure curiosity. And the way it's like we essentially understand it is that it's some sort of constitutional protection of the First Amendment. So artworks and books and films and so on have the role of transmitting ideas, right? Like it's a mean of cultural expression. And then if you essentially start to restrict the import of such good, what you're doing in effect is reducing freedom of expression within the US.
Mm.
And so I think historically this is why like this exemption still exists. And the way it's framed essentially, which I think is very interesting, is it's very difficult for a sitting president to even kind of change these exemptions. It was made specifically, the way it's created legally makes it very difficult even for Donald Trump to kind of challenge that. Obviously, there are risks. We can talk about this risk, but so far that's the way it's like that's what we know of the situation.
Yeah, it's super well. We've seen certain things take effect, so hopefully, like I said, they will stay where they are and not be affected. But well, if we think of just the artworks, but we think of the country specific tariffs, the 20% that was expected on the 9th was paused. But then there's the 10% baseline duty that was affected on April 5th. So, knowing what we know, how is that, already playing out for your clients and just your clients you're working with within your business?
So we work with a wide variety of clients, right? So we have antique dealers, auction houses, art galleries, design galleries, et cetera, right? So we kind of see it all. And essentially the impact of the 10% has no, I mean, there is no direct impact for galleries that are selling artwork, like in the sense that artworks still remain exempt from tariffs. So from that perspective,
Mhm.
like no direct impact. I think the biggest impact are more for galleries, auction houses, or essentially art market players that are focusing on antiques, design object, decorative items, and so on and so on, because these items are not exempt from tariffs. And so this is essentially kind of raising the cost of doing business, right? Like it's raising the cost of doing business specifically because it's making out like these items significantly more expensive for the end buyer that has to pay like an additional 10%. And where it gets really, really difficult is that if some of these items have aluminum or steel, you need to
Yeah.
add an additional 25% tariff on the part of these items that are made of steel or aluminum. And so overall, this is kind of the biggest thing that we're seeing. Then on top of that, obviously, there is additional costs, linked to the time the galleries have to spend kind of looking at, what tariffs means. There obviously also like customs delay all around. The kind of biggest news is that DHR is struggling so much that they essentially, struggling so much in like the backlog that they have to deal with,
Mhm.
that they now don't do shipments for individuals for items above, I think, $800. And like that's a temporary measure, but that kind of gives you a sense of how much of a mess it is.
Yeah.
So that's more on the
What
courier
what
side, not on the cargo side. Sorry.
what kind of delay? I mean, when you're thinking of this just in general in shipping, what kind of delays are you seeing just with some of these extra things happening within the business?
So in like there are different kind of delays. Like there are delays just in terms of processing. So like US customs are struggling with like all the new sets of tariffs because essentially this is something that's happening at the same time as as the increase of what we call the de minimis in the US. So like before essentially you basically didn't need any kind of like you didn't really have any some sort of like import process for items that were
Mhm.
worth less than $2,500. Now this has been decreased to $800. So like that adds obviously a lot of volume for US customs.
Yeah.
US customs cannot process them correctly. So then that ends up kind of, filling in the warehouses of like the different air courier provider, air cargo providers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of like one thing that we see. The second thing is that because US customs has so much things to manage, they also do significantly more mistakes, right? So like in terms
Mm.
of the classification of like typically artwork should be classified as artwork. And sometimes if there is like a fine line between, artwork and design, and that's something we can talk about, like they can
Yeah.
misclassify an item. And if you want to get an answer from, like the company that essentially kind of managing the import, like it's becoming very difficult because they have so much to deal with at the moment. So like you also get delays in managing problems, right? Which is the
Yeah.
biggest issue.
Yeah, that's something I want to touch on later on, just about some just actually applicable things that our clients can do when they're sort of moving into, hey, we're going to ship this work, or we're going to go to an art fair. What can we do to kind of protect ourselves or put ourselves in, best practices. But now we were, the indirect impacts on artworks, and we talked about, your clients, the galleries, especially from, are there different sort of broader effects you're seeing with the sales and sort of marketing dynamics, especially from the collector point of view? Like, are collectors changing their behaviors and rethinking like buying strategies as a result of the tariff developments?
Yeah, so we had a very interesting insight yesterday from a top-end gallery we work with, and they were essentially saying that they've had quite a few canceled sales. So like there was a gallery in the US, or like collectors that are kind of waiting to wire the funds, or they like postponing taking a decision and so on and so on. And so we start to hear these kind of things. Like our understanding, kind of talking to collectors that we work with, is there is a lot of volatility right now in the stock markets, which obviously is impacting them. Like most big art collectors have a stock portfolio, and the risk of like stagflation in the US and so on like is kind of waiting on their mind and on their kind of like, and on the perspective of what they want to purchase. Like one other interesting conversation we had with a big private collection was the following. They were essentially saying, right now, if we want to limit the risk on kind of what we buy, like they would probably spend more on blue chip items where like they know that the value is likely going to hold a lot better, or to start looking at lower value artworks. But kind of like the mid-sized market, they were like, well,
Yeah.
like mid-sized markets, very contemporary artworks and so on and so on. Like this is something they see as like a bit more dangerous. Let's say, I mean, dangerous may be a big word, but like that would inherently kind of carry more risk in terms of kind of adding these kind of artworks to the collection. So that's kind of what we're hearing. I think I also don't expect that this will hold forever. I think like the current situation is not one that's going to, I mean, in my opinion, that's going to stay for very long. But yeah, that's what we're hearing.
Yeah. Speaking of kind of, what people are buying or what they're thinking about buying, and when we think about just the next couple months and planning, and the art fairs come up. So, what international art fairs are currently impacted by it, and how does it affect sort of, the items that are imported into the US, or, just art fairs in general? Like, what are you thinking about there with your clients, and what sort of feedback have you gotten, especially preparing, months ahead for certain things, preparing the booths, just kind of understanding like what they're bringing, what they're not bringing. So I guess that's a big question. I know I've heard from clients about, just the international fairs.
So our view is very skewed towards the US, because that's where most of our clients are doing fairs. Not all of them, but most of them. And I think, I mean, for artworks, again, kind of importing artworks into the US is not made significantly more complicated at the moment. Again, the exempts for like kind of no direct risk. The bigger risk is kind of indirect. Again, like, are we going to see the same appetite as art fairs as what we've been seeing in the past? Like the answer is likely no. And I think that's making some gallery reconsider whether or not they want to go to art fairs at the moment, or if they want to go to art fairs in the US specifically, which obviously, historically has been like a huge driver of sales for most galleries. Now, where we see a much bigger impact is more on fairs for, decorative art, antiques, design items, and that's linked to essentially the way you import goods into the US. So like in the US, you don't have an equivalent to like the temporary admission processes that you have, let's say, in the UK or in the EU. So you can, like in the UK or in the EU, you can temporarily import a lot. You essentially don't pay duties and taxes, and like you can import it, and then only if you sell it, then you pay these duties and taxes. In the US, like the process that is being used is called duty and tax drawback. So essentially, you import goods into the US, you pay your duties and taxes as if it was a definitive import, and what you don't sell into the US, you send them back home, and when you send them back home, you do that drawback process. And now, essentially, because for like items such as like decorative art, design items, and so on, you you need obviously to pay historically kind of duties and taxes. On top, now you need to pay this additional 10% tariffs. And if for these items you have, again, steel and aluminum as part of the item, then on top of that, for this part, you need to pay an additional 25%. So what's happening is that now if you want to kind of do an art fair in the US, from a cash flow perspective for a gallery, you will have to kind of pay out a lot more because you don't have kind of like proper processes in like not processing, you don't have like the equivalent of like the temporary admission accounts thing that you would have in the UK or the US. So going back to how clients are kind of thinking about fairs, I mean, if you kind of put things together, right? Like, so the cost of doing an import is becoming more expensive. You have a market which is less dynamic than it's been like in like previously, and even though the past 2 years were not like particularly amazing for the art market, in general, it was like a relatively healthy market. Like now, the risk of having actually a poor return on investment as to kind of the investment you're going to make into like going like into doing an art fair is becoming more serious, and so we have some of our clients that are kind of reconsidering which fairs they want to attend. Now, this is kind of what we're hearing at the moment. This hasn't translated yet into kind of reduced amount of fair shipments, but yeah, it's likely that if the situation was not going to be, let's say, normalized, that we will see reduced fair shipments, in my opinion, and that will impact art fairs directly.
Yeah. So we're talking about like things going, and you're thinking about the big, I think I don't mind when you're talking about design, especially like Miami and some of the larger fairs there. But when we think about going out of the US, a lot of times when those tariffs are implemented, now there's a retaliation that happens that kind of balance things out, so to speak, or try to kind of correct things. So are other countries, considering you sort of implementing, retaliatory tariffs on the US made works, or, have you seen that happening or something, come up with that being in play?
Yeah, so I mean, the one I think everybody talk about was the one in Canada. So Canada was one of the first country to retaliate. They imposed now a 25% tariff, if I'm not mistaken, on painting, drawing, sculptures, and so on, which are coming in from the US. The UK is considering doing the same. So the UK has assembled kind of a list of goods they want to retaliate on. Like this has not been activated. So like this is not something that's going to be done immediately. I think in general, if you look at these kind of two things, personally, I don't think this is something that is a long-term risk for the art market in general. Like Canada did it just out of like, they had to retaliate, so they did it. The UK is kind of like preparing the round of negotiation they're going to have with the US. But in general, if you look at the portion the art market represent of total kind of trade balance, like it's so low that I don't think it make any sense for them to kind of, chip in artwork trade as part of like the negotiation. So I think right now, what happened for Canada was more a political move. And I don't expect that it's going to be a long-term move. And I also don't expect the UK to act on the threat of, imposing tariffs on US made artworks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, sort of getting into the specifics of it, especially with some things our clients can kind of, take away as far as like, how is art categorized for tariff purposes, and why is this complex? And like you're saying, if something comes in, it's already complicated. Now, how can, our clients make sure that they can reduce those complexities as much as possible? And so like when we think of art just in general, what are the categories that it falls under, or how is it categorized?
So if we speak about art, kind of what makes an artwork, right, from like a customs perspective?
Correct. Yes.
So the first element is the concept of unique work, like of uniqueness. So it has to be an original piece made by the artist, etc., etc. It should not be mass produced, etc. That's the first element. The second element is around the artistic intent, right? So it needs not to have so much of the kind of like a practical function, like the main characteristic of an artwork, like from like a custom perspective, once again, like it needs to be linked to kind of aesthetic appreciation. That's the second element. And the third element is around market perception, right? So how is this artwork being sold? Is it sold by a gallery, an auction house, and so on and so on? And like these are things that are going to be taken into account into kind of defining what is an artwork. So to define what is an artwork is not overly complicated. Where it gets more tricky is that is whenever you have this kind of fine line between furniture and artwork, right? And I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but like
Yeah.
they can be sculptures. Like if you think of like a Lalanne sculpture, typically like it mixes kind of art and functionality, right? And so from like a custom perspective, how do you assess whether it's an artwork or a piece of furniture, right? And so here, kind of what you have to have in mind is a relatively same thing, right? Like what's the primary purpose? Like is it artistic or is it functional? Like is my piece like mostly made so that because it's beautiful, and then on top I can put in some kind of nice alcohol bottles in it, and it makes a bar. Then I think that's kind of one thing that you would have to like you have to have a thought about. The second thing is around the artist's intention. So kind of initially, what was the intention of the artist? Like the idea was to make like an artwork, and like it has to be made into like some sort of like limited in limited numbers. So I think if we specifically speak about sculptures, I think you can have up to 12 casts of the sculptures and up to that amount, like it's considered as like limited edition. And in that case, you can have that considered as an artwork. And then overall, there is kind of again, context and recognition of who is doing it and who is selling it. So kind of going back to the concept of, how is it perceived by the market? If that's sold by a gallery and so on, like these are things that are going to be taken into consideration to have that considered as being an artwork and not being like, I don't know, a sculpture or a buffet or something like this.
Yeah. So given that the successful custom exemption hinges on sort of the precise, documentation. So again, just piggybacking on what we're talking about, classifying things. Could you walk us through sort of what best in class import paperwork should look like in 2025? Like key elements that are clearly stating the country of origin, or using the right language around originality and editioning, like you mentioned before. And what are some things that galleries can do to reduce the risk, knowing that sort of customs and border protection officers, still sort of retain this, final discretion of what is art, or how is this stated on the document that's going to get things through in a proper way?
I think the first thing I will say is overall, you need to over document rather than under document. I think it's very difficult. Like it's like not very difficult. It's more difficult right now to kind of really foresee how an artwork or a design item or decorative item is going to be treated at customs, right? And so there are things you can do to make sure that you kind of protect yourself and so on, and make sure that the import process is going to be smoother. And so, as you mentioned, the first thing is clearly stating the country of origin. And to be clear, again, country of origin is where the artwork was created, not necessarily where it's shipped from, right? So you can have like an old
And not necessarily who created it, but where it was created, which is also, some important.
So you can have a Chinese artist creating an artwork in Spain and shipping it to the US is not going to be considered a Chinese artwork. And so this is something that you need to have in mind. So it needs to be kind of like really clear. It's like, okay, I have that oil painting which was creating in France, shipped from the UK or shipped from Spain or whatever. And that needs to be kind of clearly laid out. So that's the first thing. The second thing is around kind of the description. So making sure that you clearly state the medium of the artwork, like is it an oil painting, is it a bronze sculpture, and so on, with some sort of clear statement which state that it is either unique or part of a limited edition, right? So this is an original painting, this is a unique painting, this is part of a limited set of limited edition, etc., etc. And then everything that you can add, like artist name, creation year, etc., etc. So that's kind of like the second block, I would say, around kind of precise documentation. Then in general, what we're also telling our clients is to make sure that they also clearly state how it's supposed to be classified according to them. So I know it's a bit tricky because you don't necessarily like for maybe registrars or gallery managers that are not like super used to kind of HS code, but I would really kind of put on the invoice directly, like this should be classified under, you know, HTS chapter blah 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 exempt under blah blah blah, etc., etc. And I can
So
send that.
just putting
Yeah,
it directly on the like
exactly.
stating this is should be classified as this and actually putting in those details.
Yeah, I mean, I would literally put in the HS code and I would refer to the legal exemptions because you never know how it's going to be treated. And if they have kind of like if customs have everything at their disposal to kind of take a decision, I mean, if like they have a lot of things that they need to manage right now, like a lot of entries. If they have everything on the paperwork, I think it's going to be a lot faster. And you also reduce the risk of having an artwork being stuck at customs. So
Yeah.
definitely something I would do. And on top of that, what I would do is I would double down in what we call the packing list, which kind of goes with the invoice. I would kind of really, again, clearly states, again, what is the country of origin and kind of making sure that the description exactly match the invoice, etc., etc. And then on top of that, if you really want to go kind of further, you don't have to do that, but like, I mean, this is not necessarily something you have to do, but you could even kind of push it and, you know, you can have a word from the artist, you can have like whatever you want to do, like this kind of essentially proving that, like, I mean, that is an artwork, it can be an expert letter, it can be whatever you want. But sometimes we actually also do that. So if we feel that there might be a risk as a shipping company, what we do, if we think there is a risk, we'll write a letter to customs that will leave with the custom paperwork saying, this is what we do essentially for clients, but it's even better if clients do it, especially because we also don't work with everyone, is to say clearly, you know, we say clearly, this is an artwork, this should be classified under this HS code, like under whatever, like this exemption, etc., etc. So we make sure that whenever it goes through, you know, this is like customs officers have essentially everything at their disposal to take a decision.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you're saying, keeping people from having to go find something, like giving them almost like a playbook that when it comes in, that if there's a question, you've already given them the answer to it. So, and doing that extra bit, as you said previously, not having some of those things, just the time and who you're going to have to speak with to get this thing through customs is probably going to take 10 times as long as putting together, you know, maybe longer, putting together some extra documentation, you know, just to get that in with the package and done with. So I think that's great advice. I mean, the more you can kind of control it, you're like controlling the situation, the better. Um, so here's a question: does it matter how old the item is when it's, you know, sort of coming in? Is there something with it, you know, sort of antiquities or sort of just, you know, pieces that were not created within a certain time frame? Are those still getting sort of marked with those tariffs if they have, you know, certain types of metals included in them?
So antiques by default are impacted by tariffs. So I would have to double check on the actual, like if there is kind of a threshold when it comes to the time it was created, but by default, because antiques
Yeah.
fall under different HS code, if they will be hit with tariff, and on top of that, if they have steel or aluminium as part of as part of the item, on top of that,
Yeah.
they will have 25% for that specific item. So I mean, yes, like they would essentially be hit with this.
Got it. Got it. Um, so one thing we were chatting about earlier when we were sort of preparing for this is just kind of the idea of like, should galleries and dealers sort of adapt their inventory or sourcing strategies, you know, to respond to this? Have you seen that happening at all, or conversations about that?
Um, yeah, we've had some conversation along these lines. Like what I will say overall out of the conversation that we had was I don't think kind of doing a fundamental shift into your overall sourcing strategy kind of makes sense at the moment. I think the situation is so fluid that, I mean, I expect that by the end of the 90-day period, this is very unlikely that, you know, we won't see things at least normalize in some way, right? So I would not change kind of the sourcing strategy now, and specifically not for artworks. Now, if we look at kind of design and antiques and so on, like my answer would maybe change slightly. So if what you're selling is likely to be hit, like is currently being hit by tariff, you could think of like temporarily shifting some like part of the items that you're importing into the US, right? And what I'm thinking of specifically, you know, if you used to import kind of aluminum made libraries, and this is not kind of 100% of your business, and you have the ability to start to import, I don't know, desks made out of wood. Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously as kind of an alternative that would allow you not to be hit with tariff, and likely you will see
Yeah.
kind of more sales, right? So that's kind of what I would have a look at. Now, again, I don't think that we will see that kind of last forever. But if that was going to happen, like in general, of course, I mean, at some point, galleries and we'll have like galleries and importers in the US will have to start to find ways to import different things within the US, right? And like to typically kind of reduce the exposure to countries that are heavily hit by tariffs, and start to build, you know, inventories with like from countries that are not hit as much, or from essentially kind of switch the inventory type from maybe, I don't know, design items to kind of rather, you know, that fine line between, you know, design items and artwork and so on and so on. And the
Yeah.
second thing though that we heard a lot more was more around kind of like where galleries are placing their focus at the moment. And obviously the US is by far the largest art market in the world. I think it will remain for the foreseeable future, but we've had quite some clients that are telling us that they start to look a lot more closely kind of east, right? Like looking at specifically at the Middle East. And you know, we were talking about art fairs earlier. Like we've had some clients telling us that they are heavily considering not doing art fairs in the US, and instead kind of going and trying to do fairs for the first time in the Middle East to kind of, you know, see if that would not be more interesting for the business. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. With kind of regions, when we think about China, now they're excluded from the suspension. So what is there a new 125% tariff on what all Chinese origin imports? So how serious is that with the galleries kind of working with artists and artworks from China? Are you seeing them shift there at all?
So artworks from China, like I mean, historically we're hit with a 7.5% tariff that was made back in 2016 with the kind of first wave of tariffs from the first Trump era. And so that kind of stayed, but now on top of that, there is an additional 20%, like which I think is essentially called the fentanyl sanction. So like
Sanctions, yeah.
So put together, it's a 27.5% that are being applied on artworks. Now, so I think, yeah, I mean, this is essentially becoming more expensive for artworks that you import in China, or at least that's my understanding of it. For antiques and design item and so on, like on top of that, right? So like you have like on top of that, you essentially kind of get full-blown impact of tariffs of like the 125% tariff. So like like there is a huge impact overall for antiques that are coming in from China.
Got it.
Yeah, so that's kind of what we hear. Now, China is not kind of like a core export region for us. So we don't do like I mean, we send to China a lot. We don't import from China so much. But yes, bottom line, what we know is essentially artworks is 27.5%. The rest is hit full blown from like the 125%, which are being accumulated with all the tariffs. So like it's, yeah, pretty heavy.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
what we're
that's
hearing,
heavy.
yeah, I think what we're hearing again from specialized dealers is like a lot of them are looking at the Middle East at the moment to kind of diversify their client base.
Great. Well, we have a couple more minutes, so just maybe looking ahead, sort of to wrap things up. So once the 90-day pause ends, I guess where do you think this is all headed? And could we see kind of a full implementation of country-specific tariffs, and what should galleries be preparing for to, avoid any disruption later on this year? I know it could change tomorrow. Who knows? I mean, all these numbers and it really nothing's in stone and it's always shifting. But from your point of view, what's your feeling on this?
So personally, and kind of what we see, so this is not engraved in stone. But my perspective is that ultimately, like, we're heading towards normalization. Like the escalation that we've seen with China, like it's the kind of like top of geopolitical tension, and I don't think this is. I mean, this is not a sustainable trade policy for the US. There is no way that would hold. It's impacting the US market already. The Fed chair, Jay Powell, mentioned that there is already a risk of reduced growth in the US. And I think if you couple that with the risk of retaliation from the UK and the EU, I mean, this would be completely unsustainable in the long run. So personally, I don't see how the situation cannot stabilize. It
Yeah.
has to stabilize at some point. So that's kind of like the idea on kind of like the wider. I mean, my perspective on kind of the wider market is this one. On country-specific tariffs, I think for sure this is something that's going to happen. Like what Donald Trump is trying to do is to hit kind of like obviously to make deals on a country-per-country basis. Like most countries don't have the power of either China or the EU. For the EU, the trade policy is kind of like under the purview of von der Leyen. So essentially, like if the US administration wants to negotiate a deal with the EU, it has to be kind of a global deal. So yeah, from that perspective, that's kind of going to be one deal for multiple countries. For all of the other countries, I think it's going to be a deal by deal
Yeah.
approach, right? Now, I think your last question was around kind of what art market players can do kind of moving forward and so on and so on. I mean, honestly, there is not a lot you can do. I think we're all victims of the situation, if we be very honest. Everyone, right? So art galleries, auction houses, fine art shipping companies, and so on and so on. And the only thing I think, I mean, again, I don't think the situation will stay where it is. I think the situation will normalize, and I don't see how it cannot normalize. So yeah, I would say 90% sure that things are going to normalize after the 90-day pause, or like at least before the end of the year. For sure, we'll see a much clearer situation. But I think the only thing you can do as a business is kind of prepare for the worst, right? So if the uncertainty persists beyond kind of that thing, is as a business, typically what we're also kind of talking about is maybe we shift more attention to the Middle East, more attention to Asia. As a antique dealer or design gallery selling design items into the US, I think you start to kind of also reconsider, is that the same inventory I want to import into the US? Do I still want to import in the US, and so on and so on, right? So yeah, the only thing you can really do is prepare for the worst. But yeah, maybe I'm just an optimistic person by nature, but I don't think the situation that we know now is going to be a situation that we'll see in 3 months' time.
Yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed. I think we've reached time here, so I just wanted to give a huge thanks to you for sharing your insights, and we really appreciate you just leading sort of the conversation here. And we hope that today's conversation, helped clarify some of the complexities around the current tariff situation, and has given everyone a little bit more confidence to how to navigate it moving forward. If you're interested in exploring how Convelio can support your logistic needs, please head over to convelio.com. And if you'd like to learn more about how Artlogic can help you grow and streamline your art business, we would love to hear from you. You can get in touch through hello@artlogic.net or go to artlogic.net to explore our solutions. Again, thank you, Edouard, so much. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we look forward to welcoming you to the next episode of In Conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.